So if you were with us several weeks ago, you might recall that this series, the Oak Within the Acorn, is really, it was inspired by this response that Jesus gave to his disciples when they asked the question, whom among us is the greatest? Jesus, out of all of your wingmen here and women, who is the most important, who's the most qualified? And if you remember, if you're familiar with his response, he said, unless you change and become like a child, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. It appears that Jesus insists that there's something about returning to this childlike perspective, this place that used to be, this place of rediscovering before the world did what the world does. You know, before the world jaded us, before it had some sort of impact on our heart, our soul, and our mind. Before the world did something that unlocked our ability, or that failed to unlock our ability to see the way God sees or understands. And he suggested, like, to be able to have that access, you have to move back to a place that used to be, which isn't easy, is it? Like, there's a bit of an audaciousness, because literally you can't go back and become 6 years old again. That's impossible. But there is this inner world within ourselves, this place of discovery, these places that potentially have laid dormant or have been dismissed. And really, this series is the ambitious pursuit to take Jesus at his word in this regard. It's about this ambitious, sort of emotive, difficult, sometimes ambiguous pursuit of saying, all right, what's happening in this inner space? And so it's ambitious, but it's also unprecedented. And the reason it's unprecedented is how we're going to get the conversation going each week. If you walk down the greenhouse hall, and I said this week one, there's all of these stories that our greenhouse kids hear that speak at a very child-appropriate level, really deep spiritual truths. And part of what's so unprecedented is we're actually going to allow those stories to inspire some of the conversations. And not only the stories, but some of the kids within our greenhouse community are going to help us do this. If you've never met Kayla or Brecken or Polo or Josie, then you're really missing out. I had the chance over the last 3 weeks or so to work with those 4 kids and their parents in preparing for this morning. By the way, over the last 2 weeks, maybe some of the most enjoyable 2 weeks of my entire 15 years ago. It was a screaming good time. If you're really wanting to spend time at Watershed investing in spaces that matter deeply, it's not that other spaces don't matter deeply, but man, greenhouse is where it's at. And especially with this group is a little different than some of the other greenhouse spaces or student space, because it's 4th and 5th grade. It's like those kids, we don't really see ourselves as children as much as we do more towards middle school and high school, but we're not really there yet. So they occupy this really powerful in-between space. And if you grew up in church thinking that greenhouse is some adult sitting in a chair reading a story and kids quietly sitting around in a circle, you have no idea what you're talking about. It is full-on energy and excitement. This group, some of the projects that they're thinking about taking on, because it's mostly project-based learning in that 4th and 5th grade space, everything from podcasts to YouTube channels around some of the issues that they're describing and talking about. It's amazing. And we're looking for people in that space that can come alongside of the leaders that are already doing incredible work. So I know that's a shameless plug, and probably I said more than I needed to in that, but man, I would love to see some of you raise your hand, sign up, talk to Blair. It's absolutely incredible. Having said that, when the 4 of us, or actually the 5 of us got together this week, they agreed to help me tell you a story that I think is so relevant and so germane to where we are in our world today. And in the aftermath of it all, this is how it all panned out.
The Missing Piece Meets the Big O by Shel Silverstein. The missing piece sat alone, waiting for someone to come and take it somewhere.
Some fit, but could not roll. Others could roll, but did not fit. One didn't know a thing about fitting, and another didn't know a thing about anything. One was too delicate. Pop!
One put it on a pedestal and left it there.
Some had too many pieces missing. Some hadn't too many pieces, period. It learned to hide from the hungry ones.
More came. Some looked too closely. Others rolled right by without even noticing.
It tried to make itself more attractive. It didn't help. He tried being flashy, but that just frightened away the shy ones. At last, one came along with just the right fit.
But all of a sudden, the missing piece began to grow.
And grow.
I didn't know you were gonna grow.
I didn't know it either, said the missing piece.
I'm looking for my missing piece, one that won't increase.
Bye. And then one day, one came along who looked different. What do you want from me? Asked the missing piece. Nothing. What do you need from me? Nothing. Who are you? Asked the missing piece. I am the Big O, said the Big O. I think you are the one I have been waiting for, said the missing piece. Maybe I am your missing piece.
But I'm not missing a piece, said the Big O. There's no place you would fit.
That is too bad, said the missing piece. I was hoping that perhaps I could roll with you.
You cannot roll with me, said the Big O, but perhaps you can roll by yourself.
By myself, a missing piece cannot roll by itself.
Have you ever tried? Asked the Big O.
But I have sharp corners, said the missing piece. I am not shaped for rolling.
Corners wear off, said the Big O, and shapes change. Anyhow, I must say goodbye. Perhaps we will meet again.
And away it rolled. The missing piece was alone again. For a long time, it just sat there.
Will you give our greenhouse kids a round of applause? Wasn't that awesome? If that's all I accomplished over the last 2 weeks, it was worth every second of it. What will become of the missing piece? Is it destined to spend the rest of its life alone, just sitting there frozen in time? Or is it a different ending? The missing piece, I think, has a couple of issues that it'll probably have to work through with a therapist maybe or a spiritual director. One being this hurdle of fitting in, right? Like this hurdle of not being able to find its place within the missing pieces world. How can I be accepted is what it's asking. How does it mean, or what does it mean to be significant or have some sense of purpose? And what am I to do when it feels like everything I have tried doesn't seem to work? And clearly there must be something wrong with me if the outcomes keep producing this much aloneness or isolation. So there's this hurdle in fitting in, which should sound a little familiar given where all of us might be this morning based on what's happened, especially not just in our life, but over the recent events over the past couple of years. I think there's also the hurdle of belief, believe it or not. It somehow believes that fulfillment and purpose are attached to finding just this like specific place in the world. This, like, if I can just get it right in this particular group or this particular idea. But it's a bit of a catch-22 because it believes that because of its shape that this is probably futile, or at least that's how we're left. In other words, the missing piece is held hostage to this idea that it'll only ever be anything other than a misfit with edges too extreme to roll. And I would surmise that this is sort of the human dilemma, isn't it? This is like what we all struggle with, at least in part. Paul makes this interesting statement in the first century, one of the writers of the scriptures. He says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And James, another author, at one point says, we all stumble in many ways. And in layman's terms, I think they're naming this misfit nature that every person kind of possesses at some level. We all live to long up to the conditioned ideals that either we've been handed or created for ourselves. And sometimes we even go as far to say that, well, this is clearly how I was created. God created me this way. I'm shaped this way for a particular reason. Hence, I should just, if it's not working out, if I'm still in pain or still suffering, I should just be content. I should just be patient. I should be obedient. I should be grateful. And it's a little bit of maybe Captain State the obvious here, but it might be worth being reminded that Jesus was notorious for hanging out with the missing pieces, right? Like in the world Jesus occupied, he was drawn to the outliers, the not good enoughs, the misfits, the rejects, the hard to loves, those kicked to the curb, those invisible, those who had been silenced, the sick, the poor, the mentally ill, the refugee, criminals or sinners in the eyes of saints, tax collectors, the sexual outliers, the sexually promiscuous, the sexually exploited, the sex workers formerly referred to as prostitutes, menstruating women, barren women. There's a little bit of a theme here emerging, haven't you noticed? Those deemed unclean, lepers with seeping sores, religious or national outsiders. These were the missing pieces that Jesus tended to roll with. See what I did there? Roll, the big O road. I just want to make sure you're paying attention this morning. You can't really read the Gospels and come to any other conclusion. And that's really hard to hear. Sometimes it's good to hear, right? Because anytime we're struggling or we're in pain, we identify with what it feels like to be an outsider. But there's an intersectionality in terms of the way that society layers itself, right? It's complex between outsiders and insiders. And when someone is undoubtedly an insider, and the systems or the powers that often locate others in the outside category, outside of normalcy. And that normalcy tends to inflict pain or struggle versus ease or comfort for the insider. That's disorienting to hear. And Jesus wasn't afraid to say truthful things to people, period, inside or outside. He was quantifiably, I think, observably, way more generous, way more patient, way more kind, per se, to an outsider. And observably, a little more direct. Maybe that's an understatement. Maybe appearing brutally honest or even harsh with the insiders, the people in charge or involved with the systems that were unjust. But I think that's, from a rational perspective, that kind of makes sense. I mean, it's sort of human nature to want revelation about complacency or culpability or guilt to be handed to you in a convenient, comfortable way, a gentle way. But again, my experience has been that's really irrational. And again, in the name of transparency, I have experience around placing those types of expectations on people who are bear the weight of decisions that I've made, who might have been injured by the decisions that we as a community have made here at Watershed, and to somehow ask them to deliver this truth in a way that causes the least amount of pain. I mean, thank God we've got really kind and generous people here at Watershed, because I think that's always their attempt. But no matter how kind they are, truth is painful. Dare I say, traumatic at times. But it shouldn't be the responsibility of a victim to manage the emotions of my insecurity or my shame or my guilt when the truth is unveiled. And Jesus doesn't have this monolithic approach in the way that he engages people. Have you ever noticed that? Like, it's almost tailor fit for each circumstance, each person. But what is monolithically true, what is universally true in the Jesus that we observe, is that when he speaks to someone, when he addresses a group of people, he never does that without calling them into something new, something different, a different future. And so if you were a power broker or a perpetrator of some sort, there's a different future for you to step towards. If you were a rich young ruler, or if you were Zacchaeus, a tax collector, or Nicodemus, a religious ruler in the cover of night, there's something different for you to see and a different world for you to create and be a part of. If you were the sexually exploited woman about to be stoned, there's some different place for you to begin to move towards. If you were the woman widowed or divorced 4 times, on your 5th marriage/relationship in a patriarchal world, there's a different future for you. If you were blind, hearing impaired, leprous, or if you'd just been healed, no, you can't go with me, Jesus would say, and you can't stay here. You have to go, and it would be this tailor-fit place specifically for this person. Simply put, if Jesus stood in front of you, there was this universal invitation to leave where you were, to move towards where you could be, a future yet not existent, one that insisted you could help create and enjoy. Which brings me back to the Big O, who does some real Jesus-y things, in case you hadn't noticed. And first, the Big O questions the entire ecosystem of fitting in. Like, is this really the way it should be? Maybe you could actually roll with yourself, is questioning the validity of the way the missing piece and everyone the missing piece encounters sort of order the world around themselves and just take for granted that this is true. A world where everyone has a specific place and they better make sure that they get there. So the Big O questions the ecosystem, but also the Big O questions the missing piece's beliefs. A belief system that says, I have sharp corners that cannot change. This is how I was created. Hence, I am destined to never roll with you, by myself, or anyone else for that matter. To which the Big O responds with, have you ever tried? Have you even given any effort towards this? Have you ever considered you may not be as trapped as you think? And oh, by the way, look at me, corners wear off. You know, probably the Big O wasn't always the Big O. There's something about the way he showed up. We're left with all sorts of doubt that's placed on the ecosystem and on the beliefs. And then we're left with the Big O actually leaving the missing piece. It seems a little bit abrupt and almost cruel. All right, see you later, which was a Jesus-y thing. Like, the only thing that would have made this more Jesus-y is if the Big O had ascended instead of rolled off to the right of the screen. The Big O seemed completely content that somehow the missing piece had everything that it needed, and that somehow it would figure it out. Now, spoiler alert here, okay? Like, because there's the finale of this, right? We don't know how the story ends, but it's a kid's book, so you know, the missing piece doesn't end up in rehab, and he's not like displaced from his family. There's nothing dark like that. But it does realize that there are edges that must be addressed. There's edges that, if they could be rounded, could be a game changer. And there's a multitude of edges that we could talk about this morning, and you probably are already thinking, like, what could be my edges? In case you haven't, that's probably a really good question. But can I just talk about 3 that I think are worth naming? And I think there are 3 that are three that I've had to work through myself. And so the first one I would call the edge of fantasy. You've heard David talk about this a little bit at times. In fact, maybe last weekend he alluded to it just a bit. But fantasy is the belief that having some ideal world or situation or relationship can somehow make me whole. It can make me complete. If I'm just certain about my beliefs about God are correct, then I'll be completed. If I can just have the right amount of money, the right job, the right space, the right city, the right house, if I can just have a certain degree of success in a particular area, if I can just have this version of family, if I can have kids that, fill in the blank, meet some sort of criteria, then my desires will be fulfilled and I will want for nothing more. Now, in full disclosure, I have desired many of those things. I still desire some of these things. And when at some level they are found or presented, like, I'm not going to lie, they're satisfying. They're fulfilling. Nobody's arguing about that. But there have been times that I have operated, and even times that I do today, operate from the assumption that somehow I am only complete when I have them. And it's this sort of sinister thing that starts to happen that does a number on me as I perceive them to be fulfilled or not fulfilled, right? Like, first there's so much weight of expectation placed on something outside of yourself. When this happens, the weight of those expectations tend to crush the thing or the person that is feeling those expectations in their life. And rarely does that end well. Like, most of the time, instead of drawing that thing nearer or actually being able to enjoy it, it ends up damaging or alienating yourself from that person or thing that you were convinced you needed to fill the void. Now, I think this too, fantasy by design needs an obstacle. So much of what is fulfilling isn't the actual receiving of something, but it's the desire, it's the longing, it's the Christmas morning scenario where when you were a kid, you spent, 11 months, 12 months really, 364 days waiting to open the presents, and then 20 minutes later, you're back playing with the gift that you had 3 years ago. It's the longing, right? And if you're a parent, you're really pissed off because I gave you this and now you're not even excited. You're playing with the box. Why are you playing with the box, sort of thing? No, nothing there to see in my trauma, right? But the obstacle keeps the fantasy alive. So there's always a group, there's always a person that serves as this barrier to what we think we need. So it needs a scapegoat in order to really be powerful. It needs a person or a group of people to blame when we don't achieve it, which means we ultimately punish or expel. Racism, for instance, is a really elementary example of this, isn't it? It's this fantasy that I will only be satisfied in a world where I am afforded power and superiority over any other ethnicity, any other person or group that doesn't look like me or that has a different color than me. And so anyone who gets in the way of me having that world, any other group or person that demands equality becomes the enemy. They become the obstacle. And it gives me the right to say they should be evicted, removed, subjugated, exterminated, colonized. Religious fundamentalism, same thing. Fundamentalism of any nature, even progressive fundamentalism that we got to be really careful about. Right? Like, there's this fantasy that if the whole world, if everyone just believed or behaved the way that I or we think they should believe or behave, then we'll have everything we want. We won't have anything else to worry about. And hence, groups or people who practice religions outside of my own are threatening. They keep the fantasy from becoming a reality, but they also keep the longing and the desire, like this fierce, red hot desire, cooking. But we have to convert them. We got to turn them. And if that doesn't work, we discredit or silence or subjugate or eradicate. By the way, there's a process, recovery, therapy, spiritual direction, treatment that one must go through in order for the truth to be known and for edges to be rounded. You know, here's what I mean by that. To believe that rounding off sharp edges of any kind is just a matter of being aware of them and then behaving differently is naive. Awareness is important and behavior is important, but to just reduce it to those two realms is the equivalent of an addict who decides, you know, I should stop drinking, but never gets to the core of what created the desire for the thing. So there's never really any recovery. It's just behavior modification. So there's the edge of fantasy. There's the sharp edge that tends to dehumanize so many people. But another kind of overlaid edge, I think, is the edge of meritocracy. Meritocracy is the belief that everyone gets what they deserve and everyone deserves what they get. In other words, it's the belief that, or faith rather, that individual innovation and creativity and strength and competency and intelligence and willpower, all of these are solely responsible for the collective experience of human flourishing or the individual experience of human flourishing or the absence of human flourishing. Now, I want to be real clear about something before we go any further here. Innovation, creativity, courage, everything that I just mentioned, I think these are all expressions of what some believe to be the divine imprint of God on our lives, and I fall into that category. I believe that's true. I believe that when something spectacular is achieved by someone, it should be acknowledged and celebrated. So I'm for those types of experiences, but to insist that large-scale outcomes are solely on the shoulders of individual choices, to believe that social, political, economic, judicial structures are always fair and equitable and everyone has the same opportunities is naive at best, sinister at worst, and doesn't align with the Jesus we read about in the Bible, if that happens to matter to you. You know, like there's this place, there's multiple places that we could point to, but there's this passage from Luke 4. It's right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and he sits down in the middle of this temple where all the religious leaders are, and he kind of announces what he's there to do. And he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free." And this wasn't some sort of, I don't know, spiritually inspiring statement. You know, it wasn't, what's the name of that book that just has all these really warm and gushy, I can't remember what it is. There's a book back in the 90s that when you, yes, Chicken Soup for the Soul, thank you. This wasn't like chicken soup for the soul type stuff. This is the audience participation part of this morning. Well done. Because I literally couldn't remember that, and it wasn't even in my notes. But no, this wasn't this, oh, look, you can do this. You can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Instead, most theologians agree this was a political manifesto. This was a pointing to the suffering and the injustices of the people who were enduring the type of world that Roman and religious governance had created, Roman occupation and religious governance. And again, it's good to celebrate and applaud accomplishments, but meritocracy that excludes systemic impact is wretched. It embellishes things like group exceptionalism, you know, this bloated sense of self-importance or self-declared superiority, because what happens is that as one group or community or nation becomes more and more disproportionately disenfranchised or disadvantaged, as things like poverty or crime or death or suffering begin to mark those groups, those realities then become attributed to character defects for everyone that rests in those groups, that entire community or nation. Those people are dangerous. Those people are criminals. Those people are rapists. Those people are gang members. Those people want to destroy our way of life becomes the not just explicit, but implicit, dehumanizing narrative. And many of us have grown up with those quietly being the bass notes of our existence. It's dehumanizing. It's also permissive. And what I mean by that, it gives permission to the benefactors who flourish within those types of systems to pretend nothing to see here. No. There's nothing to take responsibility for or like to name or own. And again, just to be reminded, the people who were labeled as dirty, dangerous, unsavory, the missing pieces, oh, Jesus, man, that's not only who he lived for, it's who he died for. Those were his inspiration. The edge of fantasy, the edge of meritocracy. And then we beat this one to death, and we're going to keep beating it to death because it is so pervasive no matter where you turn, but it's the edge of trauma. I love the story of Jesus confronting Peter right before his death. Maybe you're familiar with this story. For months, a couple of years, Jesus has continued to say, this isn't going to end well for me. And finally, a few hours before his arrest, he's with Peter, one of his main friends in all of this. And he says, look, it's imminent. It's going to happen. Probably in the next few hours, few days. And Peter's response is incredibly oppositional. He gets really angry, tells Jesus how wrong he is, which is always a good idea, right? Tell Jesus how wrong you are. He says, no, you're wrong. You're the Messiah. You're coming to usher in this earthly kingdom, and we're going to be like heavy hitters in that new reality, and we're going to crush the people who've been doing this to us. And you remember what Jesus calls him. He says, you are a Satan, man. Like, you could not be more on the wrong side of your thinking. He says, you're completely wrong, and you need to get behind me. What you thought was true was actually false. You've been living in a fantasy world. As a side note, isn't it interesting that somebody who has been described as being one of the closest relationships in Jesus' life could get it so wrong? I mean, there's a lesson there for us, isn't there? Like, just because we think we're walking so closely to something, that doesn't always translate to what's real. This is really jarring for Peter. The story progresses, and soon Jesus is arrested on bogus charges. He's accused of being a heretic and an insurrectionist, and he ends up in front of a kangaroo court. He's found guilty. He's executed. You know the story. But then he's gone. Rolls right out of everybody's life. And for Peter, the trauma is unbearable. And he runs and he begins to hide. He hides among the masses, but that doesn't really work because people recognize him and call him out. And so then he begins to deny everything. He lies about his relationship with Jesus 3 times, and ultimately he finds himself like almost in this fetal position, weeping uncontrollably, his earth feeling scorched, drenched in despair. And it's a beautiful story. And it's beautiful because despair doesn't have the last word. Jesus is resurrected, the two are reunited, and this fierce love is transformed. It's like taken to a whole new level. It's reestablished and energized. And what does Jesus do? He says, can't stay here. I'm calling you to something else. Go feed my sheep was the language of his day. Go do this new thing that you're completely ready to do, whether you realize it or not. And why am I telling you this morning? When you and I go through experiences, when we feel like the earth has been scorched, when we consider we may have edges to round that maybe we didn't really know existed or didn't want to admit actually exist. When we're left with no answers or idea how to move forward, there is an implicit type of trauma that we begin to imbibe. Seen, unseen, at the deepest place of ourselves at a cellular level. You know, it's not the explicit type of trauma per se that comes with abuse or some sort of self-destructive dramatic behavior, but it's the trauma of the old passing away before the new has arrived. And with this trauma comes grief. This sometimes it's right below the surface. This sort of ongoing sadness. I heard someone say recently that grief isn't just about death. That grief is also for the friendships that have ended, the community that you've lost. It's the grief of missing the certainty you once had, the grief of questioning your judgment, of releasing who you once were. It's the grief of feeling lost or untethered, the grief of the loss of traditions that meant so much, that was so loved. And I wanted to mention this because if the way to round out the edges of fantasy is to journey to the core issue, if the way to round out the sharp edge of meritocracy is an honest interrogation of why there is large-scale, disproportionate suffering with certain groups, I think trauma and grief are rounded out in community with other people. It's certainly not in isolation. I mean, we've tried that for the last 2 years, whatever. How's that working out? You know? In seclusion, we become, like prisoners of our own thoughts and emotions, our own feelings. And it's so much harder than it used to be, don't you think? Being vulnerable. Like being isolated almost has felt normal, which should be scary. That should bother us. I mean, even in this room, there's some of you who are here and you're wondering, do I really need to be here? Because I'm perfectly fine when I'm not here, aren't I? Are you? Are you sure? And yet, I think we're called out of our aloneness, out of just sitting there, frozen. We're called into something else. We're called towards a different future. We're called to create a different future in spite of what we're experiencing. And in doing so, loving and helping a world begin to breathe, a world begin to heal.
The missing piece was alone again. For a long time, it just sat there. Then, slowly, it lifted itself up on one end and flopped over. Flop! Then, lift, pull, flop. It began to move forward. Lift, pull, flop. Lift, pull, flop. And soon its edges began to wear off. Lift, pull, flop. Lift, pull, flop.
And its shape began to change.
And then it was bumping instead of flopping.
And then it was bouncing instead of bumping.
And then it was rolling instead of bouncing. And it didn't know where, and it didn't care.
It was rolling.
It was rolling.